time for Krishna book. This is summary study of the 10th canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, as translated and presented in storybook form by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Jai. And this is part 9. This particular chapter, Prayers by the Vedas Personified, is very, very long. So we're reading it in sections, and this is part 9. The fact is that ultimately the absolute truth is the Supreme Person. But because he's acting through his different potencies, which are impossible for the gross materialist to see, the materialists accept him as impersonal. For example, one can observe the personal artistic work in a painting of a flower, and one can understand that the color adjustment, the shape, etc., have demanded the minute attention of the artist. The artist's work is clearly exhibited in a painting of different blooming flowers. But the gross materialist, without seeing the hand of God in such artistic manifestations as the actual flowers blooming in nature, concludes that the absolute truth is impersonal. Actually, the absolute is personal, but he is independent. He does not require to personally take a brush and colors to paint the flowers, but his potencies are acting so wonderfully that it appears as if the flowers have come into being without the aid of an artist. The impersonal view of the absolute truth is accepted by less intelligent men because, unless one is engaged in the service of the Lord, he cannot understand how the Supreme is acting. He cannot even know his name. Everything about his activities and personal features is revealed to the devotee only through his loving service attitude. In the Bhagavad-gītā it's clearly said, Bhoktaram Yagnatapasam. The Lord is the enjoyer of all kinds of sacrifices and of the results of all austerities. Then again the Lord says, Sarvaloka Maheshwaram. I'm the proprietor of all planets. So that is the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Although he is present in Vrindavan and enjoys transcendental pleasure in the company of his eternal associates, the gopis and cowherd boys, his potencies are acting under his direction all over the creation. They do not disturb his eternal pastimes. Through devotional service only can one understand how the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by his inconceivable potencies, simultaneously acts impersonally and as a person. He's acting just like the Supreme Emperor, and many thousands of kings and chiefs are working under him. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the supreme, independent, controlling person, and all the demigods, including Lord Brahma, Lord Shiva, Indra, the King of Heaven, the King of the Moon Planet, the King of the Sun Planet, are working under his direction. It's confirmed in the Vedas that the sun is shining, the air is blowing, the fire is distributing heat out of fear of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The material nature is producing all kinds of movable and immovable objects within the material world, but none of them can independently act or create without the direction of the Supreme Lord. All of them are acting as tributaries, just like subordinate kings who offer their annual taxes to the emperor. The Vedic injunction states that every living entity lives by eating the remnants of foodstuffs offered to the Personality of Godhead. In great sacrifices, the injunction is that Narayan should be present as the supreme predominating deity of the sacrifice, and after the sacrifice is performed, the remnants of foodstuffs are distributed among the demigods. This is called Yajna Bhag. Every demigod has an allotment of Yajna Bhag, which he accepts as prasadam. The conclusion is that the demigods are not independently powerful. They are posted as different executives under the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and they are eating prasadam, or the remnants of sacrifices. They're executing the order of the Supreme Lord exactly according to his plan. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is in the background, and his orders are carried out by others. It only appears that he is impersonal. In our grossly materialistic way, we cannot conceive how the Supreme Person is above the impersonal activities of material nature. Therefore, the Lord explains in Bhagavad-gītā that there is nothing superior to him, and that the impersonal Brahman is subordinately situated as a manifestation of his personal rays. Sripad Srila Sridhar Swami has therefore composed a nice verse in this regard. Let me offer my respectful obeisances unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who has no material senses, but through whose direction and will all the material senses are working. He is the supreme potency of all material senses or sense organs. He's omnipotent, and he is the supreme performer of everything. Therefore he is worshipful by everyone. Unto that Supreme Person do I offer my respectful obeisances. Krishna himself declares in Bhagavad-gītā that he is Purushottama, which means the Supreme Personality. Purusha means person, and Uttama means supreme or transcendental. Also in Bhagavad-gītā, the Lord declares that because he is transcendental to all sentient and insentient beings, he is therefore known as the Purushottama. In another place, the Lord says that as the air is situated in the all-pervading sky, so everyone is situated in him, and everyone is acting under his direction. The Vedas Personified continued. Our dear Lord, they prayed, you are equal to all, with no partiality toward a particular type of living entity. As your parts and parcels, all living entities enjoy or suffer in different conditions of life. They're just like the sparks of a fire. Just as sparks dance on a blazing fire, so all living entities are dancing on your support. You're providing them with everything they desire, and yet you're not responsible for their position of enjoyment or suffering. There are different types of living entities: demigods, human beings, animals, trees, birds, beasts, germs, worms, insects, and aquatics. And all are enjoying or suffering in life by resting on you. Living entities are of two kinds. One class is called ever-liberated Nityamukta, and the other class is called Nityabhata. The Nityamukta living entities are in the spiritual kingdom, and the Nityabhata are in the material world. In the spiritual world, both the Lord and the living entities are manifest in their original status, like live sparks in a blazing fire. But in the material world, although the Lord is all-pervasive in his impersonal feature, the living entities have forgotten their Krishna consciousness, just as sparks sometimes fall from a blazing fire and lose their original brilliant condition. Some sparks fall onto dry grass and thus ignite another big fire. This is a reference to the pure devotees who take compassion on the poor and innocent living entities. The pure devotee enlightens Krishna consciousness in the hearts of the conditioned souls, and thus the blazing fire of the spiritual world becomes manifest even within this material world. Some sparks fall onto water, and they immediately lose their original brilliance and become almost extinct. This is comparable to the living entities who take their birth in the midst of gross materialists, in which case their original Krishna consciousness becomes almost extinct. Some sparks fall to the ground and remain midway between the blazing and extinct conditions. Thus, some living entities are without Krishna consciousness, some are between having and not having Krishna consciousness, and some are actually situated in Krishna consciousness. The demigods in the higher planets, beginning from Lord Brahma, Indra, Chandra, and the sun god, the moon god, and various other demigods, are all Krishna conscious. Human society is between the demigods and the animals, and thus some are more or less Krishna conscious, and some are completely forgetful of Krishna consciousness. The third grade living entities, namely animals, beasts, plants, trees, and aquatics, have completely forgotten Krishna consciousness. This example stated in the Vedas of the sparks of a blazing fire is very appropriate for understanding the condition of different types of living entities. But above all other living entities is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, Purushotama, who is always liberated from all material conditions. The question may be raised as to why the living entities have fallen by chance into different conditions of life. To answer this question, we first have to understand that there cannot be any influence of chance for the living entities. Chance is for non-living entities. According to the Vedic literatures, living entities have knowledge, and thus they are called Chaitanya, which means in knowledge. Their situation in different conditions of life, therefore, is not accidental. It's by their choice, because they have knowledge. In the Bhagavad-gītā, the Lord says, "Give up everything, just surrender unto me." This process of realizing the Supreme Personality of Godhead is open for everyone, but still it is the choice of the particular living entity whether to accept or reject this proposal. In the last portion of Bhagavad-gītā, Lord Krishna very plainly said to Arjuna, "My dear Arjuna, now I have spoken everything to you. Everything now depends on whether you choose to accept it." Similarly, living entities who have come down to this material world have made their own choice to enjoy this material world. It is not that Krishna sent them into this material world. The material world is created for the enjoyment of living entities who wanted to give up the eternal service of the Lord, to become the supreme enjoyer themselves. According to Vaishnava philosophy, when a living entity desires to gratify his senses and forgets the service of the Lord, he's given a place in the material world to act freely according to his desire, and therefore he creates a condition of life in which he either enjoys or suffers. We should know definitely that both the Lord and the living entities are eternally cognizant. There's no birth or death for either the Lord or the living entities. When creation takes place, it does not mean the living entities are created. The Lord creates this material world to give the conditioned souls a chance to elevate themselves to the higher platform of Krishna consciousness. If the conditioned soul does not take advantage of this opportunity, then after the dissolution of this material world, he enters into the body of Narayan and remains there in deep sleep until the time of another creation. In this connection, the example of the rainy season is very appropriate. Seasonal rainfall may be taken as the agent for creation because after the rainfall, the wet fields are favorable for growing different types of vegetation. Similarly, as soon as there is creation by the Lord's glancing over the material nature, immediately the living entities spring up in their different living conditions, just as different types of vegetation grow after a rainfall. The rainfall is one, but the creation of the different vegetables is varied. The rain falls equally on the whole field, but the different vegetables sprout up in different shapes and different forms according to the seeds planted. Similarly, the seeds of our desires are varied. Every living entity has a different type of desire, and that desire is the seed which causes his growth in certain type of bodies. This is explained by Rupa Goswami by the word papa bij. Papa means sinful. All our material desires are to be taken as papa bij, or the seeds of sinful desires. Bhagavad-gītā explains that our sinful desire is we do not surrender unto the Supreme Lord. The Lord therefore says in Bhagavad-gītā, "I shall give you protection from the results and actions of sinful desires." These sinful desires are manifested in different types of bodies. Therefore, no one can accuse the Supreme Lord of partiality in his giving one type of body to a certain type of living entity and another type of body to another living entity. All the bodies of the 8,400,000 species come according to the mental condition of the living entity. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Purushottama, only gives them a chance to act according to their desires. Therefore, the living entities are acting, taking advantage of the facility given by the Lord. At the same time, they are born from the transcendental body of the Lord. This relationship between the Lord and the living entities is explained in Vedic literatures, wherein it is said that the Supreme Lord maintains all his children, giving them whatever they want. Similarly, in Bhagavad-gītā the Lord says, I am the seed-giving Father of all living entities. It's very simple to understand that the Father gives birth to the children, but the children act according to their own desires. Therefore, the Father is never responsible for the different futures of his children. Each child can take advantage of the Father's property and instruction, but even though the inheritance and the instruction may be the same for all the children, out of their different desires, each child creates a different life, and thereby suffers or enjoys. Similarly, the Bhagavad-gītā's instructions are equal for everyone. Everyone should surrender unto the Supreme Lord, and he will take charge of them and protect them from sinful reactions. The facilities of living in the creation of the Lord are equally offered to all living entities. Whatever there is, either on the land, water, and the sky, is equally given to all living entities, since they are all sons of the Supreme Lord. Everyone can enjoy the material facilities given by the Lord, but unfortunate living entities create unfavorable conditions of life by fighting among themselves. The responsibility for this fighting and creating favorable and unfavorable situations of life lies with the living entities, not with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, if the living entities take advantage of the Lord's instructions, as given in Bhagavad-gītā, and develop Krishna consciousness, then their lives become sublime, and they can go back to Godhead. One may argue that because this material world is created by the Lord, he is therefore responsible for its condition. Certainly, he is indirectly responsible for the creation and maintenance of this material world, but he's never responsible for the different conditions of the living entities. The Lord's creation of this material world is compared to the cloud's creation of vegetation. In the rainy season, the cloud creates different varieties of vegetables. The cloud pours water on the surface of the earth, but it never touches the earth directly. Similarly, the Lord creates this material world simply by glancing over the material energy. This is confirmed in the Vedas. He threw his glance over the material nature, and thus there was creation. In the Bhagavad-gītā, it's also confirmed that simply by his transcendental glance over the material nature, he creates different varieties of entities, both movable and immovable, living and dead. The creation of the material world can therefore be taken as one of the pastimes of the Lord. It is called one of the pastimes of the Lord because he creates this material world whenever he desires. This desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is also extreme mercy on his part, because it gives another chance to the conditioned souls to develop their original consciousness and go back to Godhead. Therefore, no one can blame the Supreme Lord for creating this material world. From the subject matter under discussion, we can gain a clear understanding of the difference between the impersonalists and the personalists. The impersonal conception recommends merging in the existence of the Supreme, and the voidist philosophy recommends making all material varieties void. Both these philosophies are known as Mayavad. Certainly, the cosmic manifestation comes to a close and becomes void when the living entities merge into the body of Narayan to rest until another creation, and this may be called an impersonal condition. But these conditions are never eternal. The cessation of the variegatedness of the material world and the merging of the living entities into the body of the Supreme are not permanent, because the creation will take place again, and the living entities who merge into the body of the Supreme without having developed their Krishna consciousness will again appear in the material world when there's another creation. The Bhagavad-gītā confirms the fact that this material world is created and annihilated. This is going on perpetually, and the conditioned souls who are without Krishna consciousness come back again and again whenever the material creation is manifest. If such conditioned souls take advantage of this opportunity and develop Krishna consciousness under the direct instruction of the Lord, then they're transferred to the spiritual world, do not have to come back again to the material creation. It is said, therefore, that the voidists and the impersonalists are not very intelligent because they do not take shelter under the lotus feet of the Lord. Because they are less intelligent, these voidists and impersonalists take to different types of austerities, either to attain the stage of nirvana, which means finishing the material condition of life, or to attain oneness by merging into the body of the Lord. All of them again fall down because they neglect the lotus feet of the Lord. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the author Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, after studying all the Vedic literature and hearing from all authority, has given his opinion that Krishna is the only Supreme Master and that all living entities are his eternal servants. His statement is confirmed in the prayers by the Personified Vedas. The conclusion is, therefore, that everyone is under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Everyone is serving under the supreme direction of the Lord, and everyone is afraid of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It's out of fear of him that activities are being rightly executed. Everyone's position is to be subordinate to the Supreme Lord, yet the Lord has no partiality in his view of the living entities. He's just like the unlimited sky. As the sparks of a fire dance in the fire, similarly all living entities are like birds flying in the unlimited sky. Some of them are flying very high, some are flying at a less altitude, and some are flying at a still lesser altitude. The different birds are flying in different positions according to the respective abilities to fly, but the sky has nothing to do with this ability. In the Bhagavad-gītā also the Lord confirms that he awards different positions to different living entities according to their proportionate surrender. This proportionate reward by the Personality of Godhead to the living entities is not partial. Therefore, in spite of the living entities being situated in different positions, in different spheres, and in different species of life, all of them are always under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and yet he is never responsible for their different living conditions. It is foolish and artificial, therefore, to think oneself equal to the Supreme Lord, and it is still more foolish to think that one has not seen God. Everyone is seeing God in his different aspects. The only difference is that the theist sees God as the Supreme Personality, the most beloved, Krishna, and the atheist sees the ultimate truth as ultimate death. The Personified Vedas continued to pray, Our dear Lord, from all Vedic information it's understood, you are the Supreme Controller, and all living entities are controlled. Both the Lord and the living entities are called Nitya, eternal, and so are qualitatively one, yet the singular Nitya, or the Supreme Lord, is the controller, whereas the plural Nityas are controlled. The individual controlled living entity resides within the body, and the Supreme Controller, as Supersoul, is also present there, but the Supersoul is controlling the individual soul. That's the verdict of the Vedas. If the individual soul were not controlled by the Supersoul, then how could one explain the Vedic version that a living entity transmigrates from one body to another, enjoying and suffering the effects of his past deeds? Sometimes he's promoted to a higher standard of life, and sometimes he's degraded to a lower standard of life. Thus, the conditioned souls are not only under the control of the Supreme Lord, but they're also conditioned by the control of material nature. This relationship of the living entities to the Supreme Lord as the controlled and the controller definitely proves that although the Supersoul is all-pervasive, the individual soul living entities are never all-pervasive. If the individual souls were all-pervasive, there would be no question of their being controlled. The theory that the supersoul and the individual soul are equal is therefore a polluted conclusion, and no sensible person accepts it. Rather, one should try to understand the distinction between the supreme eternal and the subordinate eternal.